Well, on the occasion of Mother's Day, I thought it might be interesting to explore one of the world's most unusual religious examples of motherhood, the birth of Buddha. In order to understand this, we have to depart, it seems to me, from most of the historical traditions and realize that from the beginning in India, practically every personification or personality involved in religious literature is present not as a person, but as the personification of a principle. The whole fable account, as we find it in the East, is a series of personifications. In the West, we think of these stories as historically true, although mystics have already done considerable to interpret the mystical experience of Jesus as a symbol of the Christ in ourselves. In India, this practice was followed from the most remote times and descended from Hinduism gradually into Buddhism. Some feel that Buddhism is a reformed Hinduism. This is not really true. I don't feel it, at least personally. I rather feel that Buddhism is simply a restatement of the basic principles which are found in the symbolism of Hinduism. In other words, the Buddhist is simply the continuation of a process of interpretation, to go back again to the original pictures, the original concepts, and trace them to their universal sources. The early Brahmins were among the first to chart the structure of the universe. Long before Western man was interested in such matters, the savants of India and China had already more or less organized a concept of existence that survives with some modifications to the present time. Perhaps one of the most important differences between Eastern and Western astronomy is that in the East, the universe is alive. The universe is a living entity. The universe is both a principle and a being. It is not simply an aggregate of chemical processes. The very atmosphere of space is alive. Everything that involves change and backs the processes of evolution and involution, every law of the universe is alive. There is no such a thing as a mechanistic concept in ancient Hinduism. There were a few materialistic scholars, but they never made much influence or had much to do with the forming of Indian thought. So we have the universe conceived as an entity, a vast being whose body nature is and God the soul. Everything is ensouled by a divine power. Everything is a manifestation of an infinite invisible. So the universe becomes the great symbol of the eternal from which it emerges. And therefore it was inevitable that in old Hinduism that science and religion should be considered as one form of knowledge, because to them there could be no science without religion, and no religion without the cosmic science, which was the principal heritage of ancient India. Living in a universe of aliveness was a tremendous challenge to the mortal mind of man, a challenge which has never been fully accepted even in India. The average Hindu is no more able to fully comprehend the vastness of his own theology than is the Westerner capable of understanding the overtones of his own sciences. Each is locked in a kind of literalism. In the East, this literalism is mythology. In the West, this literalism is materialism. The average person does not go beyond the surfaces of things. And the surfaces of things fall short or are inadequate to meet the unfolding need of human consciousness. So in the ancient system, it was necessary to provide a key to an unfolding theory that could never be outgrown, the theory of an eternally growing, operating, living creation. That what we might term as a cosmic being is actually a form of consciousness, of intelligence, and of enlightenment above and beyond mind. In India, for instance, mind was regarded very largely as the slayer of the real. Most individuals live by preconceptions, either their own or of the environment in which they live. We are taught these preconceptions from society, from schools, from practically every contact we have with each other. We live in a small universe in which the intimate average thing is paramount. Most human beings live from the cradle to the grave without really having an abstract thought about themselves or anything else. They do not live in a vast world of living powers. They live in a store, in a marketplace, in a trading center. And their lives are fulfilled in the daily tasks of continuing an existence which really has very little substance behind it. The existence of trying to get out of this life as comfortably as possible. This is the primary concern of some. For others, the concern is to have as much as you can while you're here, although fully realizing that you cannot take it with you. Now in Asia, these concepts were not so real as they are here. It's true that in India and China and most of the Asiatic countries, there were very extravagant personalities. There were nobilities that were wastrel from the beginning. There were many who amounted to little or nothing, and many of the very wealthy were among the poorest citizens of the East. These things were all true, and are true even now. But beneath it all was a great layer of what might be termed the people. The average Indian, the average Chinese, the average Japanese. He belonged to a great structure of believing, and on his own level, he examined more closely than his peers the type of inward life with which he had been endowed. It was this contemplation of internals and eternals that resulted in India producing an almost complete race of sages, holy men, ascetics, yogis, those who were struggling to make the invisible on the inside more real and give them a victory over an exterior which was difficult, sad, and problem-bound. It has been estimated that at the time of the taking over of India by the present democratic regime, that there were more than 9 million self-appointed religious wanderers. These were not all foolish people. They were trying to find out something. What they were trying to find out was in their sacred books, but they never had realized it. It constituted a different approach to reality, a different way of measuring life and measuring success. We have it in the West in monastic orders, which particularly in early centuries of Christianity were very powerful. In these monastic orders, human beings turned from the temporal to the eternal and found in this a strange mystical fulfillment, something that the temporal world could not bestow. Many were led to religion by disillusionment, by suffering, by pain, by bereavement. All these things led the individual away from the daily and the ordinary into the search for something deeper and more important. We are beginning to feel this situation now, because in the presence of the great changes that are taking place, with nuclear fission hanging over the world, with practically every system that we have proving its deficiency in many, many respects, with the average individual not enjoying nearly the security of his grandparents, there has been a great recognition of the fallibility of a materialistic way of life. And all over the Western civilization at this time, there is a rising of mysticism, of a search for a spiritual value. And more persons are being disillusioned as to the importance of ways which they accepted without question a few years ago. Now, to go back to our India problem, we have in this situation more or less the problem that faced India. Because in India, the great Brahmanic system of theology was a science based upon a religion. This science resulted in the fantastic structure of a caste system, a system which perhaps had many infallibles that will soon be forgotten, but also had certain points of value that have to be considered. The caste system divided humanity into 4 levels, or general structures. The highest of these was the scholar and the sage. In the caste system, wealth was not included among the important patterns of career. Below the wise, the second caste, was the defender of the wise. And the purpose of this defender was to make sure that wisdom itself was never profaned, that there was never a time when the highest was not protected and guarded. This might cause some thought today, where if we suddenly came to the realization that militarism was part of a caste in India dedicated entirely to the protection of truth in its abstract form. In other words, it wasn't who won the battle. It was to protect the eternal values of universal law, to protect what we would term the 10 Commandments, the defenders of the faith of righteousness. Then the third caste was what we would call today average people. These were the ones who were the shopkeepers, the workers, the agriculturists, all those who had to do with the maintenance of the living standard of the people, the work people of the world, who were entitled to very high recognition for this. Those who loved to labor, and to whom labor was a religion, to serve others, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to heal the sick. These were the labors of mankind, and these were the labors primarily of the third caste, the caste that was concerned with making sure that the universal law was fulfilled in the commonplace, in the marketplace, in the store, in the home, and in the life of the average person who was never going to transcend a level of utilities. And the last caste was that of the outcasts, the Sudra. This was the caste not of the people primarily, not originally the people, who were born of a lower order. The Sudra was the individual who by nature was common, who by nature had no ideals and no integrities, who drifted about and became the basis of the unemployable, the criminal, and all those who preferred, in a sense, to remain unenlightened, to live as slaves to their own ignorance, and by this circumstance ending slaved by others. The Sudra represents, therefore, a person who, regardless of wealth, regardless of station, regardless of opportunity, goes from the cradle to the grave with no interest in the well-being of anyone except himself and his own. The individual to whom selfishness is a way of life, because selfishness is a supreme form of ignorance. The man who does not go to school may be learned. The man who is selfish is always ignorant. So these situations, taken literally, became more or less ridiculous. But lifted up to their level of principles, they had truths that are useful even in our day. Now, in the ancient system of thinking, we know that Buddhism, coming in, had as its purpose a transforming of certain East Indian symbolism into what later became Buddhist symbolism. The Buddhists did not destroy the gods of the Hindus, nor turn against them, nor declare them to be untrue or unreasonable. The Buddhist point of view was that these gods of the Hindus were not gods at all, except by man's appointment. He created them in the image of himself, and bestowed most of his own virtues and vices upon his deities. These were attitudes, these were opinions, these were misinterpretations of principles. But the principles themselves, if they could be cleared, would be very noble and beautiful. It was just a case where, as the Buddhist point of view takes it, it was necessary to convert the gods of India and make Buddhists out of them. Make Buddhas out of the gods of India. Now, it was considered to be a little tricky, but it happened so smoothly, so gently, that it was merely a matter of deepening meanings. There was no conflict, really, between the conversion of the Hindu to Buddhism in the ancient time. He could accept it or not as he pleased. It wasn't important. But gradually, out of this situation, there rose a new estimation of the principles and purposes of deities. That these deities were in reality very much like the great aristocrats of the material world. Today we have a tendency to regard with great veneration the leaders we ourselves have created. We open the door for the advancing politician. We have great respect for our leaders, for our actors, for our school teachers, for all classes of persons that we have created, and we have tremendous respect for the wealth. Wealth becomes a kind of honorary degree in the life of everyone who gains it. So we take a very humble position in the presence of wealth, very seldom questioning how the wealthy person got it, or what he's going to do with it, or the trouble he's having with it himself. These things pass lightly. Now, in the Indian system, the old Vedic gods became more or less man-created aristocrats. They were based upon principles that were true. But in the course of time, the believers limited and narrowed down the qualities and attributes of their deities, changing embodied principles into personalities. It was part of the purpose of Buddhism to reverse this motion and to restore what it originally was intended to be, that all deities, like all mortals, are servants of truth, that the supreme purpose of the deity is the improvement of his creation, that he must be constant and continuously mindful of the needs of the creatures over which he has temporary government. These deities were therefore the Maharajas, the world kings, and they were honored and recognized, but Buddhism was a little leery of them. It recognized also that the tendency of the world king was to create more and more temporal empire. He wanted larger kingdoms. He wanted to conquer his neighbors. And while claiming to be a good Buddhist or claiming to be a devout Hindu, he went out and made war upon his brothers. These things Buddhism recognized as deficiencies due to lack of one important factor, namely that true religion is an internal experience. And without this internal experience, nearly everything else is inadequate. The term Buddha, of course, it comes from an ancient Sanskrit term, which means enlightened. Therefore, Buddha is not primarily a person, but a state of enlightenment, a condition. Now, the same might be true also if we consider the Western philosophies and religions. We may personify Jesus Christ, but a Christian has to live the philosophy, live that religion. Christ is perfected in the Christian. And in the East, Buddha is embodied in the person who keeps the rules. Now, the rules are very, very simple, basically, because enlightenment is a condition that arises from a series of changes in the character and conduct of individuals. Therefore, we find the story brought into focus that Surya, the sun god, the god of all light, had a consort in Hinduism who carried the name of Maya. This consort was the feminine aspect of the sun. It was not originally a lunar divinity, but it was simply the transmission of light. It was not something inferior, something secondary, something dependent. It was, for the power that it personified, simply fulfillment. Everything that is right has to be fulfilled. Laws are made, but they must be kept. The knowledge is accumulated, but it must be interpreted in terms of common good. So in the ancient system, Surya, the sun, was the principle of infinite universal light, the light of reality, a light that is very different from just the sunball that we see in the sky. Surya was the light of the world. It was that power which bestowed upon everything that existed not only the power of life, but the power of intelligence, and ultimately the actuality of salvation. In other words, it was the creator, the preserver, and the redeemer. It was the infinite reality upon which all other things depend. It is the light in things that make them live. It is the light in our eyes that makes us read a book correctly. It is light in our heart that gives us love. It is light everywhere that transforms the darkness of ignorance, selfishness, perversity, fear into a radiant internal enlightenment. This means, as even the Western mystics have clearly shown, a change in what man sees when he looks. The individual who is not enlightened looks upon a world of difficulties. The enlightened person looks upon a world in which universal principles are fulfilling themselves, regardless of whether we like it or not. But it is perfectly possible for the individual to enter into an intimate association or comradeship with this light. So in the beginning in this system we have light. And this light becomes the principle which is not visible light, physical light, such as we can see, but a light that transforms the inner life of everything that lives. A light that shines through the darkness of every uncertainty, imperfection, and incompleteness. Now, according to this concept, then, Maya would be this light in manifestation. The light per se is in the sun deity, but this light in manifestation becomes the instrument of the enlightenment of everything that lives. Therefore, Maya is not a secondary power. The Shakti is not merely a dependent. It is in this case a principle that can only manifest through an appropriate vehicle. And that appropriate vehicle is creation. And over this creation and all that it possesses and all that it contains is the principle of this one light coming home in everything that lives. Therefore, Maya is the fulfillment of the divine purpose, as that purpose is represented by the eternal maternal principle. In the Indian philosophy, finally, in spite of what we may think to the contrary, if we go back far enough to the roots of the Vedas and the great teachings of India, we find that the eternal, space itself, the infinite potential theater for the existence of things, that which is the root of everything and from which everything must come and to which it must return, is a feminine power. This represents the inevitable state of birth and rebirth, both of which are feminine potentials. In this sense, therefore, we see the gradual transmission of this concept of Surya and Maya into the development of Buddhist legendary and lore. This legendary and lore divides abruptly into two schools, the northern and the southern. The southern school is far less florid than the northern. The southern school teaches that the only way that the individual can release himself from the great cycle of responsibilities and escape from the illusion of materiality is by entering holy orders, casting off all worldly possessions and going forth in humility and unworldliness along a path that must lead through the whole of life to death. Only when there is a complete renunciation of all material things can the curse of Mara, the Lord of Illusion, be broken. About the beginning of the Christian era, in the northlands of India, on the borders probably of China, a new branch of Buddhism slowly emerged. This branch undoubtedly emerged because of the impact of the Buddhist principle upon the consciousness of its own believers. There was no inconsistency. There was no misinterpretation. There was simply a new realization of relationships in which it became no longer necessary to assume that the great invisible cause, this eternal life, this infinite light, was tyrannical. There was no reason to assume that reality or truth must be cruel. There was no idea or realization that it was necessary to be punished forever for the sins of the fathers, that there was no hope except by this strange path of renouncing everything, including self. As a result of this change of perspective, the second school, which became the northern school, or the Mahayana, became tremendously important in the growth of Asiatic peoples. One of the simplest examples of this point is the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, known in Japan and China as Kannon or Kuan Yin, the goddess of mercy. It began in India as a male being, and early representations of it even in China are androgynous. But gradually it became a new being, for it was suddenly recognized or understood that mercy was strangely a heart aspect, that it was something, therefore, that belonged not to the creative processes, but to the redemption and release of creatures. And in this course of procedure across Asia, this deity became feminine, and is as feminine is recognized today among all Buddhist peoples. This constant motion, therefore, toward the feminine principle as beauty, as love, and of grace, of forgiveness, of kindness, of dedication, resulted in the Northern school developing an interpretation of the Buddhist teaching which is essentially happy, a joyous philosophy, a philosophy not built upon death or martyrdom, or sorrow or loss, but a philosophy based upon fulfillment, based upon the idea that doing the right thing is the most wonderful and radiant way to be happy. Then only one problem remained: how to know what is the right thing, and how to find ways of understanding it. And to meet this, we have the story of the birth of Buddha, in which a certain number of very interesting factors not generally considered enter. According to one of the fables, and there are many, by the way, and some of them are in apparent conflict, but not if you think them through. In the beginning, Surya, the god of the sun, this being the infinite light, not the light that is physical or temporal, but the light that comes with every being who comes into the world. This light, Surya, approached the queen of a little kingdom in what is now southern Nepal, and being a very courteous thing, never being bombastic or tyrannical or despotic, the eternal light asked Maya the privilege of being born through her. He wouldn't do it. It wouldn't do it if she didn't want it that way. And at first she rather objected to the idea. But after a very beautiful story was told, she accepted and agreed that she would become the mother of the embodiment. Now, what was going to be embodied? In one school, the embodied being was a bodhisattva, a being approaching perfection, who had voluntarily accepted the ministry of coming into the world for the redemption of mankind. Another view of the entire principle was quite different. Instead of being a person, this Buddha was actually Bodhi. In other words, infinite soul power, seeking to be born as the Redeemer of all that lives. Now, in the categories, particularly those we find also in Yoga and Vedanta, we have a triad of which Bodhi represents infinite benevolence. Bodhi is the love that has no imperfection, no distortion, no selfishness, no self-interest. It is infinite love, infinitely manifesting throughout space as the proof of the presence of the divine power. In other words, manifesting always through love. The eternal light comes into the life of the individual. Therefore, the immaculate birth of Buddha is also very symbolical of the immaculate birth of truth in the human soul. This is the purpose of the story. It is that we should suddenly come to realize that we must personally accept the invitation to bring into our own lives and through our lives into the world a manifestation of infinite love. Now, in the story, of course, we have the case of the Immaculate Conception again. The Buddha enters into Maya's body through the right side on a lotus throne supported by an elephant, which was Ganesha, the symbol of wisdom, the symbol of propriety. In the Indian mythology, Ganesha was quite an interesting character who gradually became much involved in merchandising. But the real truth behind Ganesha was wisdom, but wisdom as integrity. Wisdom was useless if it did not create honor. Wisdom was meaningless if the wise were not good. Now, wisdom assumedly cannot be attained without virtue. Therefore, worldly wisdom, as we find in the story of Pilgrim's Progress, can't be real wisdom at all. But in wisdom, the Bodhisattva was brought into the body of Mahamaya. And at that same instant, a blue lotus flower was placed in her hand as the symbol of the Annunciation. And of course, it's interesting that in many European figures, the Virgin Mary, at the time of the Annunciation, is given a lily by the angel. This lily is again part of the same thing. And in the case also Mahamaya, we find another interesting parallel. She is associated very closely with the moon, which in a mysterious way is under her feet. Anyway, Mahamaya becomes the mother of the Buddha. She is purity, becoming the mother of truth. She is that which is undefiled, becoming the basis and the power of redemption. And undefiled means finally and ultimately that all conduct is motivated by integrity, that all affection is honorable, and that in love and love alone can the true human being be brought into embodiment with the greatest potential for growth. Now the time came, and the king of the little country, where Maya was the queen, knew of the story and became acceptant of it, and believed her account. And in due time, when her term was complete, they went to a beautiful garden called the Lumbini Garden near his palace, where grew the painless tree, the tree that there was no suffering. She reached up her hand to pick a branch from this tree, and the child was born from her right side. Now this is quite an interesting account for the reason that in all probabilities we are to understand that Gautama Buddha was born or delivered by a cesarean delivery. This is the only thing that would account for the detail, and also account for the fact that it's carefully recorded that the mother died within 7 days. This would prove very likely true of a cesarean done at that time. So we find that instead of being brought up by his mother, he was brought up by his aunt. And this aunt became also the wife of the king, and together they raised the child. Now in this particular story we find another interesting thing, which I think tells us something of the mythology involved. When the child was born, at the moment of birth, it was caught in a cloth held by the gods Indra and Brahma. And at the same time the skies opened and the dragons of space anointed the child. Then, as only a few minutes old, the child walked, and he took 7 steps in each of the 4 directions, and then returned to his native infancy. And the Chinese indicated these steps by putting a flower where each one of the 7 footprints in each direction was placed. And in the old woodblock prints, the flowers are arranged in the form of the cross. This is another interesting point that has generally been ignored. But it is all part of a story that goes far deeper than we're inclined to think. Actually, the continuation of the life of Buddha goes into a whole complication of situations. His aunt who raised him becomes one of his first converts, and this is regarded as an indication of his true attitude on conversion. Also, his own son, who was called the delayer or the prosponer, was converted. And Rahula was born on the day in which Buddha received enlightenment. All these stories all fit together to make a story. They're very important. Actually, therefore, we find the development of the boy following a concept of picture, following the ancient customs always, but strangely breaking through them into the destiny that was intended. In the Indian Eastern situation of Buddhism, we find, therefore, many accounts of Mahamaya. At the time of the child's birth and her own decease, she retired from the world into the Tushita heaven, where Buddha himself had waited for embodiment. This heaven was 33 steps above the earth. And when Buddha came back to his father's house to preach and convert the king after he had finished his own enlightenment, one of the first things that he did was to ascend the 33 steps and preach the doctrine of redemption to his own mother. This was his second contact with her. There was one contact after this, after his own death. After Buddha died and the disciples had gathered about the great wooden casket in which the body was placed prior to cremation, the mother, attended by celestial beings, descended from the Tushita heaven to mourn for the death of her son. And as she stood beside the casket in prayer and weeping, the casket opened and the Buddha rose to console her. Therefore he rose from the dead to bless his own mother. These legends and these fables go on and on and on, but they are all trying to tell us something. And it is what they're trying to tell us, it seems to me, that is the most important of all. Actually, in the 8th century A.D., the Buddhist monk Kobodaichi went to China, where he received enlightenment, and where he brought back to Japan a great many relics and sacred things belonging to the Chinese Buddhist assembly. Among the things that he brought back was a tiny image of Maya Bunin, the mother of Buddha. And this image was placed in a little temple that was built on a hill overlooking the city of Kobe, in Japan. And this is called the White Moon Temple, or the Temple of the Lunar Crescent. And this temple is still in existence from the 8th century, and is either now in the Shingon or the Tendai jurisdiction, perhaps both. And every year there is a special and wonderful ceremony given there to honor the mother of Buddha. Now in the Shingon or the Tendai jurisdiction, perhaps both. And every year there is a special and wonderful ceremony given there to honor the mother of Buddha. It is the only temple so dedicated, I guess, in Japan as far as we know, although she occurs in much of the sacred art of the country. But anyway, once a year there is a special ceremony for her at night, and a great procession of followers, both men and women, carrying torches, go up the pathway leading up the side of this mountain to the temple. And it's a very unusual spectacle and very dramatic and moving to see these rows of lights climbing up to the abode of Maya Bunin. Anyway, the entire story now goes back to a series of principles. And I think we all need the realization that mystic Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism, has always more or less held that the whole story comes back to the individual. That the individual, we are all, in one way or another, bodhisattvas in the making. Some have gone further than others, but all, regardless of their estates, are on the way to perfection, on the way to the completion of the universal purpose for which they were intended. And this is one of the points that is quite a situation between Eastern and Western thinking. The Eastern mind has a concept, at least, of what the intentional end is. In the West, this concept seems to be almost completely lacking. The average individual going through life does not know why things happen to him. He does not know how to handle problems that arise. and when he approaches the end of life, he doesn't know where he's going or what the future holds. In the Orient, conjecture at least, symbolic thinking, has brought certain consolation relating to this type of thinking. It tells definitely that all things, great and small, from the soul in a grain of sand to a great cosmic system or a great galaxy, all is moving triumphantly and inevitably into identity with the eternal light at the source of all. But now this light has to have meaning, or just to say that we are bathed in a great radiance would not be very consoling. But this light, which we don't understand, this infinite life, is the thing that created everything that exists. It is the ultimate of wisdom. It is the ultimate of beauty. It is the ultimate of virtue. There is nothing that exists without it, and nothing that possesses it can cease to exist. All things, therefore, are part of an incredible, inconceivable, eternal value, eternal reality. To try to define this in the simple terms of human experience is vanity. We can't explain it, because we have not yet fully experienced it. All that we know of it now will be represented by little sparks, momentary senses of illumination or enlightenment. But the great value is beyond our estimation. But toward it we are moving. Therefore, the motion behind all things is toward perfection. And perfection is reunion with the infinite. Perfection is the end forever of the imperfections which cause mortal existence and mortal strife. Therefore, to the Buddhist concept, the revelation of life is this inner experience, this something or other that we all have to face or go through. Therefore, we can say, if we wish, that mortal persons, men and women alike, are all aspects of Maya Bunan, the mother. We are all mothers because through us truth must be born. We are parents because it is through us that the eternal light must come into manifestation. We will be invited to accept this destiny simply because by so doing we sacrifice nothing that is real, retain everything that has eternal value. Now, some people will say, well, that may be true, but in this eternal pattern of things, all my own personal desires are threatened. I want to do certain things myself. I want to be myself. I want to continue to exhibit my own competitive relationship with other creatures. And that, we would say then, that man declines to become the embodiment of the infinite. He is not ready yet. He must have a little more experience. He must gradually outgrow the illusions which he now regards as important. He must triumph over his own weaknesses, his own inabilities, and his own fallacies. Now, this is also more or less conditioned in the life of Buddha by the illumination scene. Buddha became a holy man. He became a searcher after truth. In the carvings and sculpturings of him, we see some in which he is nothing but skin and bones because he has fasted in search of reality. Everywhere he has sought truth. He has had the visions of the sick and the dying and the ignorant persons. He has renounced his kingdom. He has renounced his family. He has gone alone in search of the reality of life. Therefore, finally, in the great illumination scene, we find that he gains that which was the fulfillment of his original purpose. He is surrounded by the beings who have gone before him and who have found the way as he has found it. He has kept the truth. The deities of darkness, Mara, the principle of illusion, retires under the earth. Temptation fails. He is beyond all temptation, and in that way in the silence of the night, he attains the Buddhahood. Having become the Buddha, he gives the rest of his life to the ministry. Now, the Buddha is in each individual a factor which may be called Bodhi. Bodhi is enlightenment, luminosity. Bodhi is power of soul. Now, the soul is a symbol of a link, as Walt Whitman has also poetically mentioned, is a link between spirit and mind. The mind, which can be and often is the slayer of reality, represents worldliness brought to its highest capacity in the scholar, in the sage. It is this sage which in the one part of the story we find casting the nativity of the young prince, recognizing his divine destiny and regretting that he cannot live to see it, so that he becomes a teacher but cannot behold the glory of the great fulfillment. Moses was able to bring the children of Israel to the gates of the promised land, but he was not permitted to enter. All these fables go back to the human consciousness itself. We have here then the individual attempting to understand an embodiment of a divine power within himself. It is really not exactly that either. You have to hunt for just the right words. It is not that it is embodied at that time, because it is always there. But the embodiment becomes apperceivable. The individual becomes aware of this embodiment. So it is assumed that the embodiment takes place when awareness of it is achieved. But it is there all the time. It was the seed of it, the Buddha seed, was there while the spirit was itself still merely an atom in space. So in the story, each individual has to become the immaculate parent of truth. The body has to become the servant of the infinite. It has to be rededicated to the purposes for which it was originally fashioned. Thus, we start in to contemplate the problems of the virtues as we find them in the Buddhist fable. In the first place, we know that the Buddhist commandments are rather different from ours, but have the same basic ethical implications. But a modern Mahayana Buddhist does not feel that the great achievement is through renunciation. The Southern Buddhist makes renunciation very strong. The original revelation of the initiation of Buddha makes renunciation very strong. But in modern thinking, in more recent times, since the beginning of the Christian era, the path of Buddhism has been one of fulfillment, of a rather joyous state of things, a kindly and pleasant realization. This realization is that the search for virtue is a joyous kind of dance. It is not some burdensome, frustrating, tiring thing. One thing that makes it more simple is that the light we seek cannot come until we are tired of the things that hurt. Hurting is a kind of prodding. Hurting is a continuous statement of our own ineptitudes. When hurting comes, ignorance is somewhere not far away. Even physical pain can be exaggerated by the hurting of futility, where the individual has no idea, no hope, no concept of why things happen. Now, it is not often that we will find a person who has lived a long life without some pain. It is part of existence. But the purpose that the Buddhist seeks to achieve is not necessarily that he won't hurt anymore, but rather that the hurting becomes part of a recognized good, that pain is necessary to the correction of ill, that if we did not have the symptoms that hurt, we would never find a remedy for the malady. So all the problems of living are part of a growing process. And out of this growing comes the realization that Bodhi is within ourselves. The great throne of the Buddhist experience is within the human heart itself. In the Northern School, the heart doctrine, the Buddha is represented seated in the human heart, either by his appearance or by his symbol or by the ideoglyph that represents him. He is therefore the desired of all nations. He is the one who comes to heal the sorrow of the world. His miracle is perfection. His entire fulfillment is the taking over of the life. And in this taking over, every person who accepts the ministry is in a sense a Shakti. In other words, the acceptor is the feminine part of the transaction, because it is the one to whom is entrusted the bringing forth of the perfect soul and also the creation of the perfect world. The birth of the perfect soul is a symbol of the final redemption of the entire cosmic system. It is part of a great plan that goes on. And those who today perhaps are a little sad and a little troubled and a little tired by the difficulties of the times may also bear in mind that if they look closely, they will see that every mistake that is made brings a correction closer. Little by little, we get tired of our own unnecessary misfortunes. Little by little, we are going to recover from the false systems which we have now instituted as part of our way of life. But in Northern Buddhism, there is no war against these principles. The individual is not told to get up and carry a banner. He's not going to picket something. He's not going to be an activist and shoot somebody. This isn't the way it's done in the Buddhist philosophy of life. The Buddhist philosophy will never avenge himself by hurting others. As one example of that was in the case of the Buddhist problems in Burma, where at one time in Burma and in the Indo-Chinese republics, the Buddhist monks protesting against tyranny committed suicide, burned themselves to death, but did not injure anyone else. This was a peculiar point. It was a great reprimand against the other person, but the other person obviously didn't particularly care. But it was the only way in which the individual could remonstrate without violence to another person. So in all of the Buddhist philosophies, we have this particular point strongly emphasized, that it is not through violence, because it is only through the death of violence. So we are told that when Surya, the sun god, sought out the person in whom he would dwell for 3 years before he was born as Buddha, he found this pure wife of the Indian king. She was again the virgin, the symbol of purification. In this case, she was to be the anointed instrument of the embodiment. Her purity, therefore, becomes a symbol of the purity of all the Shakti that have to become involved in the bringing of the world Savior. In other words, only to the pure of heart can the mystery come. Only to those who by nature have quietly and lovingly improved their own characters. Only through such persons can the Bodhi power within themselves be released. The release of this spiritual value can never come through hate, through war, through strife, through corruption, through dissipation, or for any reason other than that the person through whom it comes has achieved internal purity. Now, purity in Buddhism means freedom from illusion. Purity is the individual who cannot be led away by falseness. Therefore, there is something about it, as in the case of some of these Christian legends also. There is something about this virginity of the mother that bears witness to a kind of childlikeness, uncorrupted, undefiled, untouched by false values because of purity of inward heart. Only this is therefore the proper parent of enlightenment. Illumination comes to the pure of heart, and those who live as far as humanly possible in peace with all other living things. Now we're going to see some of this coming along one of these days right here in our society. We're going to see that all this violence, all this clamor, all this pomp and circumstance is going to gradually fade away because it is solving nothing. All this effort to fight our way to peace, this effort to work our way to wealth and be happy at the same time, all these false values have to go, and the ability to rise above them gradually redeems the person. Every truth seeker who is honest, everyone who really recognizes the need for greater inner strength, is therefore becoming more and more a person of purity of heart and mind. It's interesting to note that in early English and other languages, the word virgin was not limited to the feminine. One of the kings of England was called the Virgin King. It was simply a symbol of integrity, of purity of motive, of purity of intention, and of the living of a righteous life in a world of temptations. So the idea of the achievement of the virgin self, the coming of the mother of the mystery before the mystery itself can be born, indicates the idea that in the heart doctrine, love becomes the mother of enlightenment. Love becomes the mother not only of human enlightenment, but in some mysterious way, expanded beyond our comprehension, becomes the one great gate that leads into the infinite. All other factors are secondary to the unselfish love of one human being for another, and of all human beings for their creating power. All these things are substanced in the Buddhist teachings. There are all kinds of legends and fables about all of these things, but every one of them has something to do with the fact that the inner person is the mother of truth, that this inner person is the love of truth, is the purification of life, and is the consecration of conduct, until finally it is the perfected soul that brings forth the Redeemer. This all becomes part of a world message. It is everywhere among the doctrines of mankind, because it is always something that has come out from within the being itself. These different religions are the human being's gradual unfolding of their own potentials. Little by little we demand a different type of deity because we are becoming a different type of being. The God of battles is no longer our saints. We no longer respect authority, power, despotism, and tyranny. We no longer expect to be slaves of some eternal despot whom we can never understand and from whose tyranny we can never escape. This type of theology is gone. And the kind of theology also that teaches or tries to teach us that because of a few short years in this world, our eternal destiny is measured, that we must go to some other place and suffer forever for sins committed by our own ignorance. These things simply will not fit into the Buddhist philosophy of life. Rather, it is always a case of growth. And I think it's also important to remember in thinking of the law of reincarnation and karma as taught in Buddhism. Buddhism does not teach that karma goes on forever, and that forever we make the same mistakes, forever we suffer for them, and we keep on suffering and going on, and as a result of eternal mistake, we are eternally reborn. This is not the Buddhist idea at all. We are not here to go on forever by rebirth. We are here to release ourselves from the wheel of the law by transcending the level of living which caused the mistakes. In other words, we are not punished but once for any one thing. And punishment is not necessarily painful. Punishment is recognition of realities, and the individual who outgrows a fault corrects it. He does not have to be tyrannized forever. The end is not punishment. The end is revelation. When the individual sees the reasons, understands them, and corrects them in himself, he is therefore in that time released from the wheel of karma. He is released from the wheel of rebirth. The enlightened soul only returns by voluntary intent. Those who have gone a long way in enlightenment, or those who are in great need of more travel, but are aware of the facts, are born again. But the great and illumined soul is born perhaps with the greatest importance, because it is a voluntary action. The Bodhisattva's rebirth is a voluntary action. Now, in the case of Buddha, there is a very interesting story about this. As a bodhisattva over a period of ages, he paid all his karma, went through all the embodiments shown by the carvings on the walls of the Borobudur in Java, and at last he came to the final decision to attain the nirvana. But there was one debt he had not paid, a debt from way back, a small and insignificant karmic occurrence, but was not finished. But it was that unfinished business that made it possible for him to come back, which was another side of their philosophical thinking. So when the poor man gave him the tainted food because he had nothing else to give, and Buddha ate it, and as a result died, he told his disciples that in accepting this tainted food, he had passed his last test. He had made right the last wrong in his existence, and therefore, having attained this, he could then go on. But instead of going on, he held that fault for ages in order to be able to come back. It was the doorway through which he could come back until he corrected it. This is kind of an interesting sidelight on some of the symbolism involved in these stories. One of the most beautiful stories, I think, of that, of course, is the Bodhisattva doctrine of Northern Asia. As we look upon the magnificent statuary and paintings and images of Japan and Korea, we see these wonderful, radiant, luminous figures of the Bodhisattva, which means the enlightened soul, the enlightened self, the enlightened being. The Bodhisattvas are the ones who have gone all the way except the last step. And there is a story of the Bodhisattva Kannan, or Kuan Yin, that at last, having gone through all the sorrows of life, having been reborn in every kingdom in order that it might know the pain of living things, having taken the obligation of harmlessness to all that lived, this being was now able to face perfection. And as it stood at the gates of the infinite to go through, it heard a funny little cry, and looked and saw a tiny birdling in a nest, the mother dead beside it. And in that moment, the Bodhisattva took the great obligation of renunciation, and took to itself the vow that it would not attain the liberation or accept it until it could take every living thing, including the soul of that little bird, with it into the infinite. Beautiful little legend. Beautiful. It tells us something, all of us. And here on Mother's Day, it seems to me a very good thing that it does, because it helps us to understand a lot of life that we pass through too lightly and too insignificantly. All that we are striving to do in our best moments and in the moments of our own enlightenment, we are striving to be useful, to help all that lives, because in this way we achieve the full labor of the Shakti. The Great Mother comes in all of us when love takes precedence over every other emotion in life. It comes when a complete renunciation of self ends selfishness. A complete renunciation of gentleness ends all hate, stress, and tension. And I think today maybe we are in great need of this kind of a religion, this kind of an attitude towards life. Under the pressure of our economic situations and political stress and international complications, the individual is moved to attitudes that are not right for him. He hates. He is belligerent. He despises. He gossips. He condemns. He is forever looking for the wrong in things. And in so doing, he locks himself in the illusion of his own material attitudes. I think there is something to be said for Buddhist mysticism which could be carried over into any religion. In other words, Buddhism is not primarily interested in making Buddhists. It is not interested just in converting anybody to anything. What it is interested in is seeing all human beings living nearer to a purpose of universal peace, of universal accord, of universal understanding, of universal affection and regard. And therefore, in this case, the Son, or the Eternal, comes to each person and asks the right to come in. This is Christ knocking at the door. Each person has the right to accept into itself this power. A dedication to the release of soul power, which is to be found by gentle meditation, prayer, thoughtfulness, consideration, and the gradual disciplining of false attitudes. If the individual becomes capable of eliminating most or the greater examples of his own inconsistencies, both the Buddhist and many other religions have also a formula represented by Yakushi Niori, the Buddhist deity of healing, the healing power of the truth, that in some mysterious way even physical sickness often has to give way to enlightenment. It can be strangely made better. There is also a very interesting formula about the great physician in the Buddhist doctrine. And the great physician came to each for a person who was sick, but they rejected him because his medicines were not pleasant to them. He told them frankly that the healing medicine was that by which the soul was changed. So they rejected him, and he went his way, and no one paid any attention to him because they wanted to have health through excess rather than through discipline. And so one by one they got sicker, until finally, in desperation, they called the great physician back and agreed to follow his instruction. When they did, they got well, and everyone lived happily ever after. The great physician is, in the Buddhist doctrine, the power of love over hate. It is the power of tranquility, the power of the great paternal feelings that we have. And it is represented very largely when each person becomes a parent of others. Each person becomes the immaculate parent for the incarnation of the great light of the world. These things are perhaps also shadowed down into our material existence. And on Mother's Day, it is very good to think of some of these things, because there is a tremendous power in the simple fact of motherhood itself, by which life is changed and transformed, and each individual moves from merely part of a pattern to one of those who is becoming a creator, someone through whom life is to come into the world. And in this life we have the physical, but in the philosophical level this light becomes the mystical. And light as physical perpetuates the species. Light as mystical perfects the whole world and all that inhabits it and all that works through it. So on this day, let's be very grateful for those who have brought life to this world through the natural laws of maternity, and also realize that this embodiment is a symbol, a very beautiful and wonderful symbol, in which the cherishing of life, in which the mystical experience that the individual goes through in the process of bringing forth a physical child, is in a mysterious way surrounded by the presence of universal laws and principles which also have to do with the production of the soul. This human soul is born through the mind and through the body. It is precipitated from the spiritual life of the individual. It becomes finally the heir to all the ages, and it is the child that will never be a pain to its parent. This bringing forth of the sun child, the soul child, the Buddha child in ourselves, is the gradual unfoldment of the eternal through the temporal, of the invisible through the visible. The principle will not be seen, but it will be made known by its preachments. And the preachments in this case represents the conduct, donations and contributions to world good, and everything that can be done to make a better life. So there's constantly coming into this world souls that are brought here, if by love, by the strongest power there is, and that the entire experience of physical love has its absolute equivalent on the higher planes by the mystical experience of soul love. And without love, there is nothing but sterility. Without love, there is nothing but death. And with love, there is everlasting life. So the gradual transformation of ourselves into the love principle is more or less a feminizing process. It is making the principle of love stronger than the principle of law, but does not break the law, because the law itself arises in an infinite consciousness of love. The law is there because it is necessary to the fulfillment of the great affection of the universal parent for its children. So all in the world we can really hope for is that gradually private people in their daily living will begin to live closer to the realities of good, that little by little our failings will be transformed by a kind of affection. When we love someone very dearly, we will sacrifice much for them. Their happiness becomes more important than our own, and we never can be happy until something or someone else is more important than ourselves. All the way through, the world of law was the world of the prophets. The world of law was the old dispensation. But the understanding of the law, not its abolishment, but the understanding of the law becomes the new dispensation, because it is that by which we gradually come to understand that law itself has no existence except as an instrument of love. As the parent must correct a child, so universal law, because it loves creation, corrects its mistakes. Little by little we move into a more rarefied and gentle atmosphere of relationships with things. We are no longer quite so heavily indoctrinated with the passing moods and attitudes that make up most of our lives. It is a good thing, perhaps, in this day of the year when we become very much remembering of our parents and those that we've known, and we remember the half-forgotten and the half-remembered. It is nice to realize that this whole pattern, everything involved in it, is nothing but divine love coming to age in the human being. And also that when the human being becomes an instrument of the divine love, then the solar system is in order. And all the worlds that are continue to fulfill their destinies under the loving care of infinite life, light, and truth. These things, if we think about them, may help us to have a little happier day today and look forward to something nice tomorrow. Thank you very much.